Okay. Now I've noticed this with a lot of people who just kind of don't really. They're not really thinking about the implications of what they're saying. Uh, Three people I'm thinking of: Zom gets Chris, Sophia Rune, Evogen videos. Maybe the Skeptical Heretic. I don't know. But these three people are racial egalitarians, meaning that they believe that all the racial differences in test scores and economic gaps, that these are a result of non-genetic factors. Okay, some non-genetic factor. What is it? That's another issue. On the one hand, they're all a result of non-genetic factors. On the other hand, they oppose racial preferences. Now, they say they oppose racial preferences, and that's their public position. Now, I'm going to deal with their public position, the position that they take publicly, um, and I'm going to deal with that. But before doing that, I want to say that I think Evogen and Sophia Rune are lying. I think they do support racial preferences, whereas I believe Zom Gets Chris does not. Um, the reason being is that Zom Gets Chris, just generally, I found her to be more willing to take unpopular stances and willing to and she tries to be consistent in her philosophy. Um, I think she tries to. I think she's making honest efforts to do so. I think I've had conversations with her on Skype. There's a lot of misunderstandings, I would say, but I do believe that she argues in good faith. So, so I believe her. I believe that she just really hasn't thought this through. I believe that she does, in fact, oppose racial quotas, whereas I think Evogen and Sophia Rune are just taking this as kind of a tactical thing. Um, the reason being is that what Evo and another reason for that is that Sophia Rune and Evogen are really animated about this racial equality. Now here's the argument. The argument there's a few, but it's mainly about white privilege. What is white privilege? Um, Two things. One is what is called institutional racism, or really institutional racial advantages. Meaning, for example, getting a job, like getting a job on a farm as a farmhand, right? You know a guy who knows a guy who knows a guy who can hire you. Oh, I know this friend of a friend who has a son who needs a job. I can give him a job. He now has a job. He can put that as a reference, right? And use that as a reference to get more jobs on down the line. And so creating a kind of a um, network, a good old boys network, not even a formal network, but just kind of an informal networks of jobs. Um, in a non-competitive economy, this can sustain for quite a while. If you have competition, any inefficiencies, it's possible that the informal networks happen to be the best choice in hiring, and and actually, I can, I can actually argue for that nepotism is economically viable, even on a purely competitive market, because the son of someone who was in fact a good employee, that son is also probably going to be a good employee. And you may look at their resume and say, well, this his resume is not that good, but the resume doesn't tell you everything. It just tells you how they performed in their prior situation. Um, but their pedigree is from someone who was a great employee. So you take them on, they're probably going to do better. For example, legacies in college admission. My nose itches. Okay, legacies in a college admission. Legacies actually perform better in college than non-legacies at Yale, and I believe the Ivy League in general. Um, I don't know about colleges nationwide, but I would assume this is true for colleges nationwide. Legacies perform better than non-legacies, despite having lower qualifications coming in. Okay, so if you want to get the best students, giving some sort of legacy advantage is a proven strategy to get good students, right? Because the legacies will do better than the non-legacies for any given qualifications, right? And we can explain this in terms of legacies, students, when you apply to a college, you're applying with a record from your high school experience. But high school experiences are variables. You may have gone to a high school and gotten off on the wrong foot with your teachers, and the teachers now don't like you and they grade you harsher, right, or something like that. And it's just kind of almost random how that is. For example, one teacher didn't like you, and the teachers talked to each other in the teachers' lobby, and the teachers started gossiping about you, and they don't like you, and you were at kind of a systematic disadvantage at that high school, just almost out of chance, just not getting along with the teacher, having a bad personality type mismatch, right, or something like that. So these high school things high school qualifications are wildly variable, right? Whereas that, for example, the parent of this student coming in graduated from Yale or graduated from Harvard and did well, right? So that would be the same environment, that college environment. So it makes sense to provide some. Well, his high school qualifications are not that good, but he's the son of someone who did do quite well. So we're going to give him a leg up and let him in. And oh, look, we let him in, and he does better than the student with the higher qualifications, but was not a legacy. So nepotism makes sense because resumes don't tell you everything, is basically what I'm saying. Pedigree has an effect, has an important effect, independent of the resume, because the resume doesn't have all the relevant information. Wow, that was kind of a tangent there. So what am I saying? Anyway, that's not what this is about. This is about affirmative action and racial preferences. The argument, main justification for racial preferences is that there's these economic systems of white supremacy or white privilege, informal networks, not even overt. And there's the other argument is implicit, that you're not even trying to be racist in your hiring practices, but you just are. Your subconscious lizard brain does it. And that gives white people an unfair advantage. Okay? And of course, the thing about this, so beautiful about these things, is that it's incredibly unfalsifiable. It's unfalsifiable, and it also fails to take into account that, legacy is a viable hiring and admitting policy. Like it's a viable strategy to give a legacy bonus. You may say whether or not it's fair, that depends on your conception of fairness. But if you're a firm and you want to get the best employee and you don't care about fairness, then you're going to want to look at legacy. You're also going to want to actually one of the best ways to do it is to give them a 30-minute Wonderlic test. That actually has a better predictor of how they're going to do at a job. Of all the applicants to any given job, the best predictor of how they're going to do at that job is an integrity test, which is maybe leave some money out, see if they take it, and a IQ test. Right? References are not particularly important. Work experience is really not that important at all. One of the most overrated factors. Education level is not important. Now, I believe there's a restriction of range thing there going on, because the kind of people who will apply to be a chemical engineer are the people who have a certain level of knowledge about being a chemical engineer, right? And you could say, well, the people, if they go to Harvard, well, if they went to MIT or something, or went to some high-level college, odds are they probably have a high IQ. And so whatever superior cognitive functions they have is going to be captured in the IQ test anyway. So where they went to college is not particularly important, because all the colleges in the hard sciences especially, they teach basically the same thing. It's not, MIT doesn't have any secret knowledge that the University of Oklahoma doesn't have, and so the instruction is probably not going to be any different college to college. So really, any difference in, and you could say, well, they went to Harvard, so that's a sign of something. Well, if it's a sign of cognitive superiority, that's going to be captured on an IQ test anyway, so what's the point? So basically the college that they went to doesn't matter as long as they have the requisite knowledge to do the job. Like if they're going to be running cracking towers, they need to know the requisite. So there's kind of like a restriction of range there. But of applicants to any given job, the IQ test is more important than education level or experience. That's another tangent there. Anyway, so implicit racism and informal networks of white privilege. So those are the arguments for the economic gaps. And the idea is that for these gaps, is that these things are self-reinforcing and they are self-perpetuating. And so in order to break them, what you have to do is institute racial privileges. That's the argument. The argument is that, one, all these races, for example, let's take black people and white people, just those two. Those are the most, that's the most storied issue. That there's this gap, okay? And this gap, the races are fundamentally the same in the brain, okay? There's no cognitive differences. There's no temperamental differences on aggregate between these populations, at least not innately. There could be some temperamental differences that develop as a result of the environment, but ultimately there's no genetics, right? All gaps are prima facie evidence of some sort of environmental disadvantage that blacks face relative to whites. That's what this is about. And you can say that you're against racial preferences, but what you're doing is you're bolstering the entire logic chain up until the punchline. And the punchline is the racial preferences, but you don't do the punchline. Okay? So that is why I believe that Ivo-Jen and Sophia Roon are in fact in favor of racial preferences, because they make the argument all the way through, but then say, oh, but I don't support this. And saying that they don't support racial preferences is tactical, right? Because it prevents... Because when you say you support racial preferences, suddenly shit gets real, right? And suddenly the impetus of this dispute becomes known, right? That's the punchline. That's the reason for this argument. It's about racial preferences. You can also make further arguments about racial integration in multiracial communities. Is that going to happen? Okay, or should communities be allowed to self-segregate? Right. That's another question. Right. Immigration to countries. What's going to be the result of immigration? For example, we know now with African immigrants to the United Kingdom, generally as a group, this group is a drain. They tend to vote for. They tend to try to vote themselves the resources of the indigenous Britons, white Britons. And so that's what they're doing right now. And if that situation, if this state of affairs of black Britons being an underclass, quote unquote, and just being a drain and voting themselves the resources of white Britons, if this condition is congenital, then then you're not going to want to. Then you're certainly not going to want to bring in any more, and you might want to consider, deportation, right? And recognizing that they're not British people, right? You can take a German and raise him in a British family, and he'll become British. You take an African and raise him in a British family, he's going to become a black person with a British accent who speaks English. I mean, that's so. It has implications in terms of immigration policy. It has implications in terms of racial privileges and racial quotas. And I don't believe that Sophia Roon and Ivo-Jen oppose racial quotas. They're going to say they don't. That's tactical. That's kind of a tactical thing. So if they did support them, I think they would say they did not, because it gives them kind of a leg up tactically. So that's all I want to say here. But So on the one hand, either they're lying, which is kind of nasty and underhanded. But on the other hand, it's possible that they simply don't know, that they're simply not aware of all the implications of what's going on here, right? So either they're lying or they're really stupid by opposing affirmative action but making all of these egalitarian arguments all the way through. Because if they make these egalitarian arguments, the ultimate and they are in fact humanists. Now it's possible. I think there's a third possibility here. One possibility is they're lying. One possibility is that they're retarded. The other possibility is that, and by retarded I mean they don't really see the implications of what they're doing, of what they're advocating. But a third possibility is that they recognize the racial inequalities and ascribe all these racial inequalities to environment or white privilege or whatever, some sort of non-genetic factor. But they don't care about the racial inequalities, and because they don't care about them, they don't think it's a pressing issue. They oppose racial quotas, and they just don't care, and they're arguing about this race issue so fervently for some other reason, right? Because the fact remains that they are very animated about this. So that's a third possibility. I don't think that's very likely at all. Just being so animated about this makes me believe that they are, basically have drunk the Kool-Aid in terms of this kind of mythology of white oppression. I think they're true believers in this regard. I think they're true believer humanistic creationists, and that they do in fact support racial quotas. I believe less likely possibility is that they just don't understand the implications of their beliefs. I think they do understand the implications of their beliefs and they're just lying. And the last possibility is that they really care about this racial equality in a descriptive sense, but they don't care about it in a prescriptive sense, which would be bizarre. I mean, it's possible, but I don't think that's really likely at all. Okay, this was kind of a rambly video. I'm going to stop this here.